This will be an introduction to the book of Esther, as well as a discussion of chapter 1 of Esther. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. If we look at the book of Esther, we can describe it, we can outline it as follows. Chapters 1 and 2 tell the story of how Esther rose to queenship. Then chapters 3 through 8 describe the feud between Haman and Mordecai involving a plot of genocide against the Jews in Persia by Haman. And chapters 9 and 10 will tell us how the Feast of Purim came to be established. Let's introduce the characters in the story of Esther. First of all, beginning with the king, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, depending on which Bible translation you're using. The scene of the story is in the Persian capital of Susa at the time that Ahasuerus or Xerxes was king of Persia with his wife, Queen Vashti. And although those names seem very different, Ahasuerus and Xerxes, they're actually both garbled versions of an almost unpronounceable Old Persian name. And you can see that Old Persian name here on the right in red. I'll let you try to pronounce it. I'm going to pass. The queen is called Vashti, which is a little bit of a problem because historically, Greek historians, Herodotus in particular, call Xerxes' queen neither Esther nor Vashti, but a woman by the name of Amatris. Some scholars think that Amatris and Vashti, in Hebrew is actually Washti. Washti and Amatris may be garbled versions of the same name, just like Xerxes and Ahasuerus are garbled versions of the same name. And so that's at least one possibility. Of course, Xerxes had a harem of many wives, and Amatris, mentioned by Herodotus, may have been yet another of his wives. Well, anyway, as the story develops, the girl Esther, with the help of her cousin Mordecai, won a beauty contest that allowed her to marry Ahasuerus Xerxes after Vashti fell into disfavor. A feud between Haman and Mordecai the Jew then led Haman to conceive of a plot of genocide against all the Jews in Persia. Haman convinced Xerxes to issue a decree to destroy the Jews. But then Esther intervenes to save the Jewish people. She risked her own life, for she had not yet revealed to her husband that she was Jewish, by intervening to save the Jews from his decree. And thus Esther saved the Jewish people from destruction, while Haman ended up being hanged. And those planning to harm the Jews were themselves destroyed by the Jews. And this deliverance from genocide then came to be celebrated by the inauguration of the Jewish feast of Purim, which is described in chapters 9 and 10. So that's the characters of the story. Who's the author of the story? And the answer is we really don't know. The book itself is anonymous, probably a Persian Jew, though the book does not say who he or she might be. Traditionally, it's been attributed to Mordecai, though that is not clear. Another question that comes up in the debate is the question of genre. It's clearly a narrative, masterfully told narrative with lots of action, drama, suspense, irony, humor, and climax. But the question is, what kind of narrative? Is it historical narrative? Or is it more like a historical novel that's mostly fictional, although it refers to historical personages? Well, let me give you some evidence that we should understand Esther as history. In chapter 1 and verse 1, it rightly describes Xerxes's or Ahasuerus' empire as stretching from India to Ethiopia. And this is true, as Herodotus notes, that Xerxes had conquered the northwest part of the Indus River, and Earlier Persian kings had conquered Egypt all the way down to Ethiopia. The book of Esther also rightly leaves a gap of 4 years between the disposition of Vashti and the taking of Esther as queen, which fits into the history of the Persian Empire well, because that's the time when Xerxes went on a campaign against Greece. The banquet was in his third year, which is 483, and that corresponds to a great council that planned the invasion of Greece, as described by Herodotus. But then he suffered defeats at Thermopylae in 480 and at Salamis in 479, and this led to his abandoning his Greek campaigns. And hence, 4 years later, when we get to Esther 2 and verse 16, that's in his 7th year and 10th month, which would be either December of 479 or January of 478. That would be after his Greek campaigns have failed and he has returned home. Here you see the campaigns of Persia against Greece. He sent an army by land who suffered defeats at Thermopylae and later at Marathon. And then he also sent his navy, who suffered defeat at Salamis. And between all those defeats and also another one at Plataea, he eventually abandoned his campaign and came home and comforted himself by marrying the beautiful girl Esther. Another thing that's interesting is that Mordecai is an authentic name in the period, and indeed there's at least a case to be made that he's mentioned in extra biblical documents. There's a cuneiform text which indicates that a certain Marduka, which seems to be the same name as Mordecai, was a court official of Xerxes, or late in the reign of Darius, at Susa. And this could be the Mordecai of the Bible. Another Greek historian, Ctesias, claims that a certain Martakas was most influential of the eunuchs among the 3 men of great influence at the court of Xerxes. And again, this Martakas could be a garbled version of the name Mordecai. In any case, Mordecai is a name current at the time. Indeed, there's many names in the book of Esther that are actively attested to in Persian period documents. Mordecai, and then you see a list of all the other names and the verses in Esther that refer to them. Those are all mentioned in Elamite texts in Persepolis, but the Elamite capital was Susa, which is the location of the story of the book of Esther. In addition to all that, there are even Old Persian words in the Hebrew of Esther. Here you have 3 words that have Persian derivation that are mentioned in Esther chapters 1 and chapters 3 2 times. Well, let me get to the problem of the book of Esther. The main problem is a theological problem. And the problem is that the entire book of Esther never makes any kind of a direct reference to God. And it's distinct in that regard. Only other book in the Bible that does the same thing is the Song of Solomon. It never directly mentions God as well. And so we have to ask the question, where is God in the book of Esther? This seemed to have troubled ancient readers as well, which is why in the Greek translation of Esther, there were some additions added to the book, and these additions are found in the Apocrypha, it's called, and they're included in Roman Catholic printings of the Bible. These additions to Esther add all kinds of God talk to both Esther and Mordecai, making them far more religious, overtly so, than is the case in the Hebrew version of Esther. For example, in Esther chapter 4, it adds the lines, "Then Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling into remembrance all the works of the Lord. And he said, Lord, Lord, you rule as king over all things. For the universe is in your power, and there's no one that can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven, and you are the Lord of all. There's no one who can resist you, the Lord." Well, it would be nice if Mordecai had actually said that, but all scholars agree that these are additions to the book of Esther and are not originally part of the text. There's also moral problems that go along with the theological problem. The moral problem is, what is a nice Jewish girl like Esther doing in a Persian harem like this? It seems immoral for Esther to have participated in a kind of beauty contest to marry a pagan, though she may well have had no choice. But then why did Mordecai work real hard to help her to win this beauty contest and become queen of Persia? It seems inappropriate for her to want to try to marry an unbeliever. And other aspect of it is both Mordecai and Esther seem to be Persian derivation type names, or at least pagan derivation type names. Mordecai seems to be the Akkadian word Marduka, which means literally man of Marduk, named after the pagan god Marduk, the god of Babylon. Esther seems to be from the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, or possibly from the Persian Stara, which means star, which may also refer to the planet Venus, which is what Ishtar represented. And so why are they having these pagan names? Now you might say, well, Esther did have a Jewish name, Hadassah, and Mordecai might have had a Jewish name too. And Daniel and his friends had both Babylonian names and Jewish names. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're not religious Jews. But on the other hand, the lack of mention of God on their lips makes you kind of think that maybe they're on the secular side of things. And then finally, there is the theological problem of and ethical problem of, why does Esther show no mercy in the book? Why does she insist at the end of the book that Haman be hanged? Why does she press forward a decree allowing the Jews to slaughter and plunder their enemies? Why does Esther go out of her way to extend the slaughter for another day beyond the original decree? Martin Luther, known for his speaking his mind, said this. He says, "I'm so hostile to the book of Esther that I wish that they," referring to Esther and Maccabees, "did not exist, for they Judaize too much and have and reveal much pagan bad behavior." Indeed, Jews and Christians from time to time have wondered whether the book of Esther really belongs in the Bible. But let me mention a few general valuable things that we can find from the book of Esther. We see in the book of Esther the theme of divine deliverance, that God did work through Esther to save his people from annihilation and keep his remnant alive. We do see something of the theme of the believer and the world. One of the central concerns of the book of Esther is, well, how would a Jew live in a hostile Gentile world in which a Jew would find himself in? Do we obey the law of man or the law of God? And when Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, assuming it was to avoid idolatrous homage, well, he was an example of rightly living in the way that a Jew should, and not showing idolatry towards people. And of course, Christians have the same question. You know, are we Christians first, or is our Christianity something that we should hide if it's inconvenient? There's always the danger of assimilation, of becoming like the world, if we don't allow God to be central in our lives. And there's a danger of retaliation against us by non-Christians if we are overtly Christian. And so where is it legitimate to conform with the rules of a non-Christian society? And where must this believer stand out and be different? Well, Esther and Mordecai give us at least some exemplary models in this area. Esther ultimately has the courage to risk her life and identify with her people. Mordecai is an example of a law-abiding, good citizen Jew. He's willing to be different, especially in his refusal to pay homage to the wicked Haman. But the greatest theological value in the book of Esther is the theme of the unseen providence of God. Though God is never mentioned in the book, God is there for those with eyes to see. He's working in and through and behind history to accomplish his purpose of saving his people from this wicked plot. And so as we go through the book of Esther, we will see the theme of divine providence. So that's a brief introduction to the book. And now let me move into the content of Esther. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So here we have the introduction to the book, introducing the king, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, if you read the NIV, who ruled Persia from 486 to 465. Our story begins in 483, the 3rd year of his reign, with a great banquet at Susa, which had been previously the Elamite capital, but had been made one of the capitals of Persia by Xerxes' father, Darius. Historically, this may have been given in conjunction with the planning of Xerxes' campaign against Greece that began in 480, though it proved rather disastrous for Persia. Now, note in this story that there was a lot of alcoholic drinking going on. The drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. And he also showed off all his wealth. And like all Persian kings, and perhaps more than all the ones before him, Xerxes was enormously wealthy. And we have artifacts from Persia that show some of the wealth of the royalty of Persia. Here you see a golden amulet, and you see some wall carvings, and you can see a golden vessel, and you can see all the monuments. This is at another city, Persepolis, yet another of the capitals of Persia. Here is Ahasuerus or Xerxes' father, Darius, seated on the right there. And here you have another scene where you have Darius in front, and behind is his son Xerxes, who would actually succeed him before his father had actually died. And again, Persepolis shows some of the great magnificence of the Persian emperors. They had an army that had soldiers from all ethnicities. This is on the tomb of Xerxes. And on his tomb, he indicates that there were Persian, Median, Elamite, Parthian, Aryan, and all kinds of other nationalities that were a part of his army going all the way to Ethiopia, as we note. And this is the tomb of Xerxes built on a mountainside. So that's the beginning of the story. But now we have this account of how Vashti came to be deposed. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. And then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for it was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and who sat first in the kingdom. He asked them, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? And then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persian Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Now, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so when the king is made by the king is proclaimed throughout all the kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king, and the princes and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now, the main point of this story is to prepare the way for the coming of Esther. Chapter 1 explains how Vashti came to be out of the king's favor, and that prepared the way for her replacement by Esther, who would be better, in the words of verse 19, better in the sense of both more beautiful and more virtuous than Vashti had been. Now, the king Vashti refused to obey the king when he summoned her to come to the banquet. Now, what seems to be going on is that the king considered Vashti little more than one of his pretty toys. And Vashti, understandably, didn't much like the idea of being gawked at by a bunch of drunken and lustful men. Indeed, some Jewish interpreters think that she was, when she was told to come before them wearing her crown, that what she was being asked to do was to come appearing wearing her crown and nothing else. In other words, appearing stark naked before these drunken men. Whatever that may be, the queen's answer was very clear. She said, "No way. Forget it. I'm not going to do it." And she refused to come. Now, of course, at this, the king was furious. And so he asked his counselors, well, what is to be done about Queen Vashti for this disobedience? And the counselors told the king that this set a dangerous precedent, and it could cause women everywhere to start disobeying their husbands. And so they convinced the king to issue a decree. And there were two elements of that decree. One, that Vashti was not to come before the king. That was kind of poetic and ironic justice, in that his decree is that she is now not to do what she previously wanted to do, which is not appear before the king. So now she must not appear before the king, whereas before she chose not to. And furthermore, she would ultimately forfeit her queenship that would go to another. And then in addition to that, there would be a decree sent throughout all the vast empire of Persia, a decree declaring that wives must treat their husbands with respect. Now we should note some of the irony here. Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, was the greatest absolute monarch in the world of his day. He was master of absolutely everything except, that is, for his own wife. And I can't help but wonder if our author isn't making a little fun of Xerxes here, that even though he was the master of the universe, he had no control over his wife. But there also seems to be some absurdities in this decree. I mean, is it really true that Vashti's disobedience undermines male authority throughout the world? Does her disobedience justify bringing into full play the communication system of the entire Persian Empire? That seems a little ridiculous and overboard. But you have to remember that these men had been drinking a great deal of alcohol. I would dare say they were drunk as skunks. And so you have to imagine them, talking to one another as they go into this. They're saying, well, what should we do about this Vashti's disobedience? Well, there ought to be a law against such things, as they take another drink. You should pass a law. You're the king. Pass a law against disobedient wives. And the absurd decree, which states that the queen's lack of appearance was in fact the king's command, which demands female submission to husbands also, was sent out with all due solemnity before they were sober enough to rescind it. A bit more irony here. As David Noel Friedman points out, there's some irony in the fact that this decree, by which the king establishes the supremacy of the male in his own household, initiates a story whereby the king, having got rid of one recalcitrant wife, ends up with one, namely Esther, who controls him completely. And Stan Goldman also points out an irony. Vashti was removed for disobeying the king's order, but later Esther will be rewarded for it in chapter 5 and chapter 8. So what are we to make of the book of Esther? What lessons can we draw from it today? Well, in this banquet at the beginning of the book, we can see a number of sins that we should avoid. We have the sin of materialism. Xerxes was unbelievably rich and wanted to make sure that everybody knew it by this opulent feast. No extravagance was held back. The display lasted for half a year, and the feast lasted for 7 days. There was magnificent plush, colorful curtains, lavish pillars and furniture and precious stones, golden vessels and the like. But such grandeur often comes at the terrible price of human pride and eventual ruin. Earthly greatness and prosperity are mutable and transitory. And in the end, whether in this life or the next, God humbles the proud and exalts the lowly who trust in him. It is perhaps not by coincidence that Ahasuerus Xerxes died by an assassination. We also see the sin of drunkenness. The sin that makes fools even of kings and their counselors. We also see the sin of treating women as mere toys and trophies, as Xerxes did with Vashti. And this is contrary to the biblical teaching of how men ought to love and take care of their wives. I would suggest that we can lift up and commend the moral courage of Queen Vashti. She was a wife, she was not a sexual exhibitionist, and though she lost her queenship, she did keep her integrity. But perhaps the most important thing here is the thing that's behind the scenes, and that is the providence of God. You see, if Vashti had not been deposed, Esther would not have been promoted to a position to have been able to intervene with Xerxes to save the Jewish people. It was only with Vashti's fall from favor that God was able to put Esther in a position to save his people. And so God, though not mentioned, is behind the events of the story. Well, that's my introduction to the book of Esther, and we will continue on in some future time.